Vertex School, and for the next week, we're going to be interviewing our mentors, who are currently working at some of the
Recording in
best
progress.
studios. I just got a big recording in progress that came across my face. Sorry about that. So for the next week, we're going to be interviewing our mentors who are currently working at some of the best studios around the world. We're also going to be going and doing some reel reviews at the end of the week. So make sure if you have any reels or projects or anything that you would like us to review on Friday, we're going to be doing that all day. We've already got quite a few people signed up for that. So please get your things in as soon as possible as we pick out who we're going to be reviewing. To start us off with all of this is going to be Mike Jungbluth. Mike is currently working as Bioware's animation director. We've worked together and even sat next to each other when we worked at ZeniMax, working on The Elder Scrolls Online. Beyond just admiring who Mike has been and where he's taken his career and his animation work, I'm actually really happy to be able to call him one of my close friends. So without further ado, I'll turn it on over to him and let him give you a great presentation.
Awesome. Thanks, Dan. Taking me back to when we sat next to each other and played a whole bunch of DayZ and Payday 2. All right, so I'm just gonna go ahead and get started. I feel weird when I don't, even if it's just me talking to myself, not having the video paying up. So let me just get situated. Fantastic. So yeah, like Dan said, my name is Mike Jungbluth, and when he asked if I wanted to speak and what I'd be interested in speaking about, I really wanted to focus on player movement in games, because to me, it's really the perfect example of the challenges and the opportunities that are unique to game animation, as opposed to other forms of animation. But first, I'll give you a quick intro and a bit of a brief introduction. So I've been working in games for over 15 years now. The last 3.5 of those have been at Bioware, and the last couple of those as the animation director now on Dragon Age. And before that, I worked really at a handful of other studios on a range of different games. But really, it's been a couple or a few of these that have informed me the most in how best to approach the problem and the challenges of player movement. Specifically, that was Agents of Mayhem. There we had 12 playable characters, each with their own unique personalities and playstyles, which was the culmination and inspiration for this talk specifically. But honestly, I'd also be remiss if I didn't pay due to my time working with Dan on Elder Scrolls Online, because there it was the needed attention to milliseconds and lag that was a touchstone for how I approach these things. So really, our time working there together, is the reason that I'm now getting to talk to all of you right now, which is pretty cool. So I really believe that it's due to these unique challenges from these two games that I've been able to find any success in overcoming challenges that go into creating player movement that both looks and feels great when you play it. So really, what's the secret of player movement? And at the core of what makes for good player locomotion is that it needs to be fluid, responsive, and full of personality, which for a slide that can fit pretty easily on the middle of your screen, that's a lot easier said than done. Because I mean, as you've all become keenly aware in your animation journey, it's hard enough on its own just to make a locomotion cycle that looks and feels good and hits all of those things, from the fundamentals of physicality and then the personality of the character on top. Cycles and locomotion is something that animators just regularly crash against the rocks of making it work outside of how to make it interactive. But when you get out of that ocean of despair and to dry land with a cycle that works for games, that ends up really just being the beginning of the journey to get this stuff working. So let's look then exactly what makes something that is so fundamental to a character and to animation so much more difficult in games than film or TV or any other form of animation. And like anything, it's really the challenge of interactivity that makes all of it all the more interesting and fun. So making a player character that looks and feels great while running around in the world is one of the hardest tasks that's going to be given to you as an animator in games. It's a constant balancing act between not just the art, but then also the design of the game and designers and the tech that may or may not be available to you with your engine and your tools. But beyond that, it's also a balancing act between what you want as a developer, as a creator, and then what the player wants and what their experience of it's going to be. And all of that means that it's generally an incredibly biased conversation for every one of those people, from the animator, designer, programmer, player. Everyone's going to have really strong feelings as to what the expectations are going to be for player movement. Because you see, designers are going to want it to be as instantly responsive as possible. Preferably, in their mind, responsive would be one-to-one with the player movement and that player input. So what they're looking for generally is, as soon as the player moves the stick in a direction, they want to see the character instantly move in that exact same direction and at that same speed, right? As an artist, though, as generally as craft of animation, we really want it to feel like it has that proper physicality, right? Including good weight and a nice, clear and consistent velocity with appropriate follow through, which can then feel entirely antithetical to what design is looking for. So that usually then boils down to having these zero-sum arguments regarding animation-driven movement, which is generally where animators want to be, versus the physics-driven movement that designers are often going to be asking for. And when you start the development of a game with animation and design and tech all at each other's like boiling points and throats, it's never a good thing. So really what we want to do here is we want to say, how do we, even from the beginning, calm those conversations and get to the heart of what's important to player movement. And even outside of that development, larger development team, these are all the sort of things that you should be keeping in mind if and when you start to play around with player movement in Unreal or Unity, since both of those are getting to a point where it's a lot easier for people to just kind of get in there and start hooking stuff up and making interactive characters. So let's start first, since this is a group of animators and animation focused people, to really focus on what we most care about, which is fluid movement. So in this case, when I say fluidity, I mean that to include weight, the general physicality, the overall appeal, the crafty artist stuff. And I think a lot of times people believe this has to come at the cost of responsiveness, but it's not true. So I'm getting ahead of myself. So let's look at some ways to get better fluidity and visual fidelity, regardless of any interactivity needs. So to find out what you really need with, say, your animation systems and your locomotion system, I like to strip things down to their barest form and then build up from there. So for player movement, the barest form is going to be 2 animations. That's going to be your stand and that's going to be your run. So what I like to do is say, let's start by just having those 2 animations and blend from one to the other without any transition animations at all. And by here, you can just adjust how many frames you want to blend in game. That's a pretty standard thing that's available to you in engines now. So that's kind of a good place to start on. By doing that, you can probably start to play with how quickly do you want your acceleration to happen, and how quickly do you want to be at speed, and what should that top speed be? All of those are things that are great to be able to lock down with just this. It's not going to look the best, right? Like this looks pretty bland, but it's going to help you to understand how to look at things and what they look like when they just blend in game at the desired camera angle, and to see exactly where you and your team want to build up the better visuals. And for games like a MOBA, right, that's top down, honestly, even just these two things could be enough. And you'll see that, pretty common in some games like this, or mobile games where maybe it's a um, less screen space or smaller characters on the screen. But for a third person game, like we had here in Agents of Mayhem, and the camera is closer to the action, these two alone won't cut it. If you look at something like Zelda Breath of the Wild, they actually didn't use much more than this though. So really, based on your game and the aesthetic, um, this is why it's nice to start with so little, because you'll start to feel, what are the things I missed the most, instead of starting at the most expensive version and then trying to figure out where did we go overboard. So when we did this exercise for Agents of Mayhem, what we really missed were a few things that we wanted to use transitions for to help with fluidity and fidelity. Specifically, we decided we wanted the 4 directional jog starts. So when you're coming from idle into each 4 directions. We wanted 2 180-degree jog turns. So if you are running forward and you run back, we want that, and back to forward. Like, we wanted to make sure that those all felt good. We also wanted unique cycles for walk, jog, and sprint, and we wanted unique stops for each of those. On top of those transitions, you'll see here additive leans to help get some nice, as you're deflecting your stick around, your character leans into the angle as needed. There's some additive head looks and additive torso looks, so that when you're doing those leans and your character is adjusting, since we only have those strong 180 turns, that gives you a way of sort of breaking up and making it feel like the character is leading and leaning into the turn, and breaking up sort of the head to lead, and then the body, or the torso, then the body sort of stuff. And then let's see. So with all of those, it's a good bit more than just obviously those two things, but it's still not as robust as some other games, which could have 90-degree jog turns. You could have walk starts and turns, and sprint starts and turns. Not to mention, sometimes you'll have left and right starts, left and right foot starts and turns. Mirroring, like it can get incredibly complex, and it's easy to kind of go into those worst case scenarios. But I really like starting here and going, you know what, this actually hits what we're looking for. This also, of course, means how many animations you're going to want here is going to depend on your aesthetic style, right? In the same way that Breath of the Wild is able to get away with less because of sort of how minimal some of their aesthetic is. If you look at something that is a lot more realistic, like a Red Dead Redemption or a Last of Us, those require a lot more, and the overall quality bar is going to say, hey, you need a lot more. I think Agents of Mayhem was a place where we did a really great job of adding really only what was needed, and not trying to worry about covering all of the things with unique animations, and had an aesthetic and an art style that was just stylized enough to let us get away with not having to get that full coverage. The other part of all this is studying and breaking down what each new game is doing when you play it, right? And really getting with their player locomotion, sort of doing the reverse version of this, where you look at what are all of the things that they're doing here, and where can I start to get an understanding on how they're doing that, so that you can start to figure out, well, would I need this for my game, and what would it take for me to be able to add this to my game, right? And this is often something that you find as animators get a little bit more time in games, that they start to do this with every new game, that they just kind of get on the sticks and they see where they're doing and how is it working, because it really helps us to continually collaborate or calibrate against what everyone's doing, and to understand sort of where the possibility space and quality bar are across the industry. So let's then really break down some of these things that I just called out here in more detail so that you can kind of do the same with the games you play. So let's start at some of those individual transitions. And really one of the biggest things you can do to make your transitions look better is to give them some amount of time before you just get into your jog loop, right? Because chances are those loops are pretty short. A fast one can be 12 frames, maybe it's up to 24 frames if it's something that's a little bit longer step and slower gait. But you don't want to get to that right away, right? Because if your jog loop starts, say, on the left foot planted and your right foot crossing, your jog transition doesn't have to end the very first time that your left foot is planted and your right foot is crossing during the motion. So what do I mean? If you see here, you want to allow the character some time to maybe dip down, get into the action before they rise up and kind of get into that jog. You really want to use this to let the appropriate amount of time for that follow through to happen on the arms and the torso as they sort of, if they're doing a turn, as they're getting into the direction, and to give that some time to breathe. You really want to use this as that opportunity where animators say, I want more fluidity and I want more weight in what I'm doing. And that's exactly what these transitions are meant for. So don't limit yourself to hitting that run pose, that run loop pose at the very first time that is needs to happen, because you can go long. So in most cases here, I think maybe it's the second time that pose comes about, so that I've got another full cycle to get them to rise up into that cycle. Is more or less what I did here. Though you can see in something like Hardtack, that bigger character, getting even more time to kind of get into that cycle and to get around into place, versus Fortune, who's meant to be more of a fast, agile character who gets into it a little bit faster. So what you can really see here is that on the left foot, on this frame 24, which would generally be where you might go, okay, I've 24, that's almost a second. The start animation should be done and I should be into the loop. But really here you can see that even on frame 24, he's still pretty far down there, pretty far compressed. Even though that the legs are in a passing pose, where once we get to frame 41, now we've had that extra 17 frames. Is that what that is? 17 frames of the loop. Now he's at that loop pose that where his loop cycle would be. And so having a 41 frame long animation for a jog start, obviously not instantaneous, that's almost a second and a half, is totally cool though, because you can take as much time as you need with just a little bit of markup on your animations. So if you haven't really used any game engine stuff before, markup is considered sort of a universal term for something that engines allow that you can use to add some additional information to your animation that a larger animation system is looking for. So in this example, the markup here is this green bar section, and you can see that we've called it, it's an early out trigger. Early out, cancel trigger, all of these are sort of common terms that get used. And what this means is that it allows for other transitions or movements to interrupt at this point in the animation as needed. So as far as the game is concerned, the transition is still done at frame 15. And at any point, if the player hits their stick in a direction, it's going to respond to that input and move there. And it's going to make sure that, oh, the left foot is down, so let me push off on the left foot and all those sort of things. In general, things like that foot tracking can get tracked pretty naturally now by systems, and they can recognize left foot planted versus right foot. Sometimes you still have to actually do that manually and mark up your loops to say left foot is down during this range, right foot is down during this range, or whatever. But really more and more systems are able to track that now, which is great, because there was a time that, and it still happens when you have to tag every footfall, can be a little time intensive, but it's worth it, right? Because it does allow that ability to blend out as needed. any questions you have about these, keep them in mind. We can follow up at the end of this, since I might be moving a little bit fast on some of it. So what you can see there, though, is that we didn't really get far in talking about fluidity until that line with interactivity gets kind of blurry. But honestly, that's great because this is when you know you're onto something. This is what's great about games, is that no one thing can sort of do it all on its own without having to incorporate another discipline and another part of the player experience and interactivity as a whole. So it's those times that something can't be solved entirely by one discipline or skill set that you get that magic. So let's really get into the game design side of animation and really look at how to fully embrace responsive controls in regards to animation driven movement. But before we can really get into turn speeds and frame counts, I want to first talk about J-turns. J-turns is just what I call it. I don't know if that's a industry term or not. You see these, it's less common now, but you still see it sometimes where when you do a 180 turn, just the natural physicality of it as a person, right, is that you're planting your foot and you're rotating around it, which means your mass is going from, say, if you plant with your left foot, the left side of the foot to now the leg to now the right side, which means you've pivoted around a point. And what this means then is if you were to trace that line, that trajectory out on the ground, your characters run forward, and if they're turning around, now you've kind of made like a J hook or a candy cane sort of hook. And it's just natural. You're going to see it in mocap. If you're doing the physicality, even in keyframe, it's just naturally going to happen where you're running and then they kind of go off center. But when you're cleaning up animation or when you're really wanting to get into the responsiveness, you want to focus on getting the character to turn and stay centered because really this is going to make it feel great as a player. And there's a ways you can do it without sacrificing visual quality or making it feel wrong. You just want to be conscious of it when you start cleaning up the data. So here's some examples of these two characters making the 180 turns. Again, if you were to look at it and be like, does this make sense that they're sort of able to pivot in place? Not really, but you can still make it be believable and mechanically sound and give that general alignment to the center of the character. And maybe when you look at it out of context, you're like, that doesn't look right. But the benefit that you're going to get from gameplay is that if maybe somebody's on a narrow platform and you pull a 180 turn, they're not just going to run off the side or kind of get foot sliding as the collision holds them on the side of that thing. That's just going to look clunky, or they'll fall off, which looks bad. General alignment issues, like all of those are things that seems kind of small, but makes a big difference. So really putting that pivot of the character right there in the middle and getting that to match up is just really going to make a big difference in making the game feel better when you're playing it. Okay, so with that physicality of the turn sort of understood, how fast should they turn, right? Because should it really be instantaneous, the way design often would say, to make it feel the best? Well, to answer that, I really want to talk about what responsiveness means. So I'm going to nerd out about milliseconds here for a little bit, but really what it all comes down to is timing, which again is at the heart of animation. So let's nerd out about milliseconds and frames. Something we did on Elder Scrolls Online is that we recorded people clicking a mouse with a high-speed camera. Wasn't this video? I don't have access to the video. ZeniMax has access to the video, but this kind of gives you an idea. And when we watched in slow motion, we wanted to see how long it took to get to that satisfying click that we all naturally perceive as being instantaneous when you click your mouse, right? Like that's sort of one of the most things that's just in people's psyche of this is immediate. And what we found was that the fastest players would get that click about 1.25 seconds after the start of their depress, right? So the time they actually physically press the button to getting the click 0.125 seconds. And for the slowest person clicking the button, 2 seconds was at the max. So what we found was that really there was an average range for most people. In their mind, instantaneous means 0.15 to 0.175 seconds. So what does that mean for us? That means that the fastest in instantaneous anything is 3 frames. For something that is instantaneous for somebody with slower responsiveness is 6 frames. And for most people, instantaneous means 4 to 5 frames of time. So not a lot, but already instantaneous doesn't mean frame 1. It means up to frame 6 sometimes. So let's also look at how animation works, which is really the entirety of persistence of vision, right? Which explains that the human eye and our brain works and that we really only process 10 to 12 separate images in a second. And then, we see how all the stuff comes together. So if a subsequent image replaces that previous one in the period of time before it, it creates the illusion of continuity, right? So if you're, say, animating all of your frames at 30 frames a second, 10 to 12 separate images means every 3 frames that needs to get updated. So that sounds pretty familiar to those mouse clicks. So what does all of this mean? What it means is that humans naturally have lag built into our senses, and we're used to it. It also means that responsiveness and animation fundamentals are not diametrically opposed, but intrinsically linked together. So when someone tells you that they need something that is instantly responsive in your game, it actually means it needs to react within 3 to 4 frames, which may not seem like a lot, but in gameplay animation terms, 3 to 4 frames can really convey a ton. Because it doesn't mean every action needs to be complete in that amount of time. It just means that there needs to be a meaningful amount of change in the motion for it to be perceived as responsive. So let's see what all that means when we're actually authoring turn animations. On Agents of Mayhem, we defined clear metrics for all of this stuff. And we wanted to use the root as the foundation for our metrics. What that means is that in games, there's always sort of a simplified player root joint, which controls the simplified player capsule, which in a lot of cases generally drives everything that the character does. In simplest terms, you can kind of think of the root as a treadmill with wheels. And whenever you move the control stick around a game, you're controlling the treadmill with wheels, and the character sort of jogs around on that treadmill. It's a little reductive, but at least kind of gets you in the right mindset. So what were these for us? For jog starts, the character's root motion needed to be complete by frames 10 to 12. And the jog turns when the character is already moving. For those 180 degrees, we wanted the root motion to be entirely completed by frame 12. So those aren't 3 to 4 frames, like we just said. So what does all of this mean? It means designers were still happy with the turn speed of these animations. And on the game, it was never called out that these turns felt like they were too slow or lagged. In fact, player movement was often cited as one of the highest benefits and positives of the game. So let's really dig into what's happening on those first 10 to 12 frames of the animation, and specifically those 3 to 4 responsive frames, since we know those are where the magic really lives. So this is the very first frame of the turn. On the left, you see what it looks like in motion builder in the animation file itself. And on the right side, you'll see what it looks like in game. So in the animation file, already on that first frame, I've got it so that the body is starting to turn, specifically the head in the direction that it's going to be going. And the foot is up, right? Because in game, it doesn't look the same, right? Because there's always going to be some amount of blend time again in these animations. So in our case, we had 3 frames of blend time in all of our jog starts, in all of our move starts. So what I wanted to make sure was that on that first couple of frames, having the head and the leg already started isn't going to be represented in game, but it's going to already start to give us some velocity in those blends right out the gate, so that it's going to feel like the character is likely going to be moving forward in the previous animation. So it'll be about 1/3 of the way between that previous animation and the turn. So what this means is it'll be taking those 3 frames to get to the animation we authored, and by that time that we do it, we'll be looking like they're going to be actually already turning or aware of the direction they want to go by that 3rd frame, which is what makes it feel responsive, not the fact that they've fully turned.
Hey, Mike, we lost your audio there.
I'm wondering if his headset timed out or something, because he can't hear us either, it seems. I'll pull myself up. Mike.
Hear me?
Oh, we can hear you
Hello?
now.
Hello?
We lost you a couple of frames back.
Oh, you lost me a couple frames back?
Yes, sir.
Okay. That was weird. What's going on there? Let me just plug in my headphones. Maybe they're dying on me. Sorry about that. I should have
You're
had
good.
Oh, there's the chat. I should have had the chat window. I failed. All right, so let me go back. Let me know where. Let's see. Were we here?
I'm waiting for it to refresh on my side. Right now I'm seeing frame 2, 3, and 10. We were still looking at when he had just first started lifting his foot, and you were finishing with speaking about those 3 first frames.
Okay, cool. So we just finished talking about these first 3 frames?
Yes, you were just finishing up with that one.
Okay, cool. So yeah, start the animation like it's gonna be moving and mobile. So then here are what frames 2 and 3 need to look like, because these are going to give us a little bit of context. So at frame 2, now you can already start to see, hey, it feels like the character is responding to my input. And at frame 3, which we know is that magic responsive frame, here you can see that, oh, it is clear where the character is planning on moving, what their focus is on. And because we're getting that 3-frame blend in game, that doesn't come as a detriment. It comes as a benefit because we've already, in the animation itself, started to rely on that intent of that blend to get us where we needed to go. So then when we look at frame 10, which we know was the one that we called out as the metric that we needed to have the turn completely, the root completely turned, even though the root under the character is pointed in the full direction, you can see the body is still dragging behind, right? Like that back foot is still planted behind and just starting to rise up. You're getting some of that drag still on the weapon. So the general mass of the character is where it looks like it needs to be, but we're not worrying about by frame 10 it needs to be into the cycle pose, because that's going to lose us all of that weight and fluidity that we talked about with having those longer transitions, right? And so what we can say here is that, cool, now the player is in the direction they want to go by frame 10. They've had the feedback that on frame 3 they got what they wanted, and in 1/3 of a second they're now moving in the direction they want to be, which is great. And if we need to cancel out of this now because they want to turn another direction, they want to go to attack, they want to jump, whatever they need to do, it's going to blend pretty well because most of the body mass is where you want it to be, even though not all of it is. So the way we want to make all of this then additionally feel more responsive is with 2 more bits of markup data on the animations. So we want a no turn trigger range, which is right here from frames 0 to 7. And that means literally just follow the animation turn data, right? That's important that we maintain whatever we've animated in Maya, Mobu, whatever. And then we have this frames from 7 to 14, which is, okay, you can start to allow some player movement to adjust that to match up the, we have it authored to go 180 degrees. Maybe they've got it at 135. And so we can kind of adjust, right? And let some of that wiggle start to happen there. So what that means is the character will still look good, but they're going to get to where they want by frame 15, and that the character will now be headed in the same direction as that stick deflection. So a couple more bits of markup. Again, markup is your friend in games because it lets you control when and how stuff is going to look beyond just the animation itself. Speaking of blending well and looking good, part of fluidity, right, is velocity. And maintaining consistent velocity across movements is one of the most important things you can do. Nothing really feels worse than when you're holding down stick and the character arbitrarily speeds up or slows down between actions. It's just gross and feels wrong. Transitions are, of course, then especially where this is most important. So along with wanting to make sure we had those consistent turn metrics, we wanted to define the metrics for when a character is meant to hit and maintain their movement speeds. So what this meant for us, on jog starts, we wanted them to be at jog speed, which for us was 5.5 meters a second, which is pretty fast, by frames 11 to 13. So shortly after they get in the direction they want to be at, we wanted them to be at that 5.5 meters a second. With the 180 jog turns, because you're moving in one speed and then turning and going another, we said frame 20 is when we wanted those to be back at speed. Again, we're not saying that those transition animations need to be complete by those frames, just that the character needs to be moving at that appropriate jog speed by those frames. So again, this is where it's great to be able to sell that follow through and the overlap in the motions, really for as long as you need, because we've got those early out tags, but we can get that nice overlap and settle. So here you can kind of see where, let me go back. Here you can really see where you get that bit of the anticipation, and then for the most part, it's hitting that consistent jog speed all the way through. So move stops. This is the next one. These also tend to lead to a lot of frustration because generally designers want a character to just stop immediately on a dime, and animators want to be able to sell the weight of slowing down after a sudden halt in velocity. And for a player, they want to stop on a dime and still have it feel and look great. So again, we need those defining metrics early with designers so that you can know what kind of stops you're going to need and then where you have to sell it with sort of visual trickery. So for agents, these are what we used as metrics. For the walk stop, we should keep the route in place so that it stops immediately. You're not moving very fast. That's fine. For jog stops, we wanted it to be about 4 meters or 0.4 meters within 7 frames. So less than half a meter in 7 frames. And then for sprint stops, where you were moving at the highest speed, around 6 meter or 0.6 meters in the first 10 frames. So here you can see exactly what the stops transitions look like for each one of those. With this knowledge, we knew that the change in velocity was going to be, so really how much of the force we needed to sell, the follow through of the motion of the character was clear for us. Because as a general rule for player movement, no matter the size or weight of a character, you can move them as quickly as you need, as long as the weight is sold once they get to the appropriate amount of follow through, right? Like the Hulk can move as quickly as you need, as fast as you need, but when he gets there, you want to feel that weight and follow through. But really, just beyond using them for walk or jog or sprint, these can be general move stops because we know they're just based on a velocity, right? They're really just different speed stops more than anything. So where really what I mean for this is on Elder Scrolls, we used our jog stop also as our dodge stop. So the beauty of this was that we could end our dodge rolls in the run pose. So if the player dodged while running, they would just instantly go back into run and it would work great. But if they stopped pegging the stick during the roll, then they would just play the jog stop and it would carry through, which allowed that additional weight to happen without making for a longer dodge roll itself or locking the player into that roll animation longer than what they really wanted. So what this meant for Agents of Mayhem was that we used walk stops also as our turn in place. Because we play the directional jog start on that button press, we get the initial push off in the desired direction, but then the desired direction is under our jog speed threshold because we know it's going to take up to 10 frames to get to that speed. So it's going to automatically trigger the walk stop animation. This meant that characters could kind of turn as quickly as they needed to in whatever their desired direction, and that there will be still a sensation of movement coming to rest as the character settles back into place. We did this because stand in play and turn in place animations in tech can be one of the most super expensive and time intensive things that you can get into. So this is kind of a great trick to get something for almost nothing. Just make sure that you author those walk stops to have those additional foot shuffles to get back into place, as that's going to help sell the momentum of the turn. It's not as pretty as like one of those really great turn in place systems, but it's generally free and responsive. And as a general rule, if there are a couple ugly frames on input, as long as the follow through looks and feels pretty good, most people are going to be okay with it. Okay, so feel, fluidity, those are established. Now let's really get on to how and where we can add characters' personality to their movement, since that's really the point of animation. So a good place to get some instant differentiation is by asking which part of the body leads the movement. This is a pretty standard acting class exercise and can be a really helpful way in getting some differentiation across your character. So let's say a character leads with their head or their chest or the hips. That can really inform both their physical and psychological prowess. So if you lead with the head, it can show that they look before they leap. They're constantly aware of their surroundings. They're always willing to jump headfirst into action. If they lead with their chest, it's going to help them feel a little bit more bulky and a little bit more cocky. If they lead with their hips, letting their head drag behind, they can really feel like maybe they don't have a care in the world, sort of drifting through life without a worry. So really how far you choose to push these elements is up to you. And it's going to really require in establishing and maintaining the order of operations that are needed to make sure that you're getting those responsive elements within the frames that you need so that all of that still works. But really, it's like every rule, right? As you start to understand, I need something by this frame, and you internalize that, you can start to figure out where you can break some of the stuff and where you can start playing with those so that all of these characters should felt as responsive as the others, even though we started to play with some of those things. You also don't have to have your characters move at different speeds to feel like they're faster or slower than one another. You can sell weight and speed entirely through aesthetics, like with hardtack here. After animating Fortune, the small agile character that I was shown initially, since she was one of our smallest characters and we set the metrics with her, I wanted to establish with hardtack as the second character, since he was one of the largest, and prove out that the metrics could work for characters of any size. And this happens and works for two reasons. First, the amount of time it takes the character to recover from jog starts and turns to sell the weight can be variable, right? So you can have a character move as fast as needed, as long as, again, that follow through of the weight is appropriate. And then the second you're going to get just naturally based on the character size, which is stride length. Having a longer stride length will keep the legs from moving as fast, which will influence how fast it looks like they're moving. So just having a smaller character moving at 5.5 meters a second is going to shorter strides, faster steps. It's going to make it look like she's moving faster than somebody who is almost twice her height is going to make it look like he's moving slower, even though it's at the same speed. And really, all of this became one of my favorite things when people talked about or played the game, because often we would get this feedback that they think Fortune is moving faster or that she character is more agile than the other, even though under the hood they're 100% same metrics. We're just selling it with the magic of animation, which leads to the most important aspects of runs, which is that they're the embodiment of a character's personality and performance. This is really going to be the animation that players see almost more than any other in the game. So it should really be one that reinforces everything you want them to know about the character's personality. So these are all the runs for the player characters in Agents of Mayhem. We made each character's run, walk, and sprint be 4 cycles in length so that we could layer in some subtlety and give some time to work in a little bit of more of a natural performance and cadence to their movement, so that it wasn't just the same 17 seconds or 17 frames, 20 frames over and over. Things that we tried to always keep in mind are how physically capable is the character? How aware are they of other people watching them? How much does it feel like they're putting on a show? Would they be shy, or does it feel like they're trying to show off for people? How uptight are they versus how relaxed are they? Where is their center of mass? All of these are the types of questions you really want to always be asking when you start a cycle, because it's going to help to define the how of the way they should run and move, and help to set them apart from every other character that you're going to have in your game, so that they should all feel a little bit different, a little unique. And the same goes for sprints as well. Not all sprints are the same. It seems like most times people have characters sprint by compressing and leaning into the direction more, but that isn't and shouldn't be the case with every character. The Olympics are on right now. If you watch them when they sprint, they actually almost have a curve to their back that has them more upright in the way that they run. So even something as little as how much someone is leaning forward versus back will help to inform and convey how capable an athlete they are, without changing the metrics at all. So that's really the sort of best general approaches to player movement that I like to keep in mind. I wanted to do kind of a quick shout out here at the end, because like everything we do in games, there's always some amount of tech that is ready to start upend how we approach things. And specifically for player movement, what's looking to disrupt everything are a few. So there's procedural animation. This means that the movement is being driven entirely by curves or functions from the game, often physics. So here's a great example of this. The way it could be working is that it's creating the in-betweens of just individual poses, like what was done on Overgrowth, and then layering in different springs and curves to give it life. Or it could be creating additional limbs or layering in the ability to crouch, like what gets shown here in the Ubisoft IK rig talk. Or it could be creating entirely procedural movement based on IK foot plants and springs, like with Unreal's Power IK. Almost all games are using procedural animation now, if not for outright creating full animations. It could even just be layering in additional reactivity to the world, like seen here in Uncharted 4. Last of Us does as well, where they're sort of always adding this sort of physics ragdoll reactivity on top of the character to give it that life and that feeling like it's part of the space. Another bit of newer animation tech is motion matching, which is getting added to most engines now. Instead of sort of using those smaller individual animations that fit into sort of a complex node graph that was like what we've done in agents and really for the past couple of generations of games. What it's doing is that it's pulling in real time from a database of all the specific animations you'd like it to play. And then what it's doing is that it's tracking at all times the specific pose that is live at that moment, the speed that they're moving, the facing that they're going, and it's informing what part of any animation within your database is the proper one to play for whatever the next input is for the player. As you can see, the weight and subtlety of the movement is really astounding, and it always picks the best pose to pull from to seamlessly blend to the best pose of the next animation. So really more and more games are using this now, and while not every engine has this yet, it is something every engine is working to integrate. The biggest gotcha here is that you want some pretty big robust tools so that you can debug it, and how to better direct it to use the animations you want when you want. But when you have those, you can see some really great results. All of EA Sports games use it. Last of Us 2 have used it. It started with why can't I think of the name? The Ubisoft game that was like the Vikings versus Knights versus Samurais. Just totally blanked on the name of it. But a lot of games now are using this under the hood. And then from there, machine learning, which exists for everything. The difference there for motion matching is that with motion matching, we've curated all of the data that's available for the game to pick at runtime based on sort of specific inputs and the markup. But with machine learning, it's training a model, oftentimes offline, and it's based on as much animation or motion data you can feed it. Then what the model is doing is you're essentially putting that into the game, and it's sort of generating these things based off of what it's learned from the data that was given to it. Everything you're seeing in these videos is motion that's created by a machine learning model that was trained purely on raw motion capture data and then generated at runtime. A lot of places are doing this stuff. This is a paper that's being done by someone in conjunction with EA. Ubisoft has their own team that's dedicated on this. Machine learning is really starting to happen in all sorts of really interesting ways, and is just going to be showing up in games more and more. So that doesn't mean that with that new tech, everything that was covered in this talk just gets tossed out the window. All of that stuff remains necessary. It just means you're always going to need to be finding the solutions and approaches that happen during the mocap shoot, to the way that you clean it up, to the runtime in the game, to get those core tenets of fluidity, velocity, responsiveness, and personality. I mean, those are always going to be needed, no matter the tech. So if you feed the machine quality, it's going to spit out quality. If you feed it crap, you're going to get back crap. So much like adapting those sort of traditional animation principles we have for locomotion and figuring out how it works for interactivity and integrating design, the same goes with all of this new technology. So as you're getting into animation and if you're wanting to get into games, buckle up. Like there's a cusp. We're kind of on the cusp of some pretty big paradigm shifts that will sort of always require us to adapt everything we know about animation to ever-growing sets of tools. But as long as we really build upon what we've learned and embrace the ability to adapt our skills to new approaches, it's gonna be a great ride. And that is everything for me. Hope you enjoyed it. Thanks
Awesome, Mike. That was really, really, really great. Thank you so much.
Yep.
Now, if you have a few moments to stick around for a little bit of Q&A, I'm going to see if we have any questions that have come up. If anybody has any questions that they'd like, please fill in your questions so that we can gather those up and figure out what we'd like to answer. But for myself personally, Mike, that was really, really great. I actually have several students right now in what we call term 2 who are going into those transitional animations, and they're using run starts and run stops and doing things along in these ways. So I find that it's going to be really, really beneficial to those students that are working on those things right now. For me personally, it was actually really beneficial as well. so that I remember and constantly remind myself to stay on that bleeding edge, so that my services are still considered useful. So I very much appreciate you going through all of this, because for me, it's always a pleasure to listen to you talk, even though I got to see this presentation a little bit earlier than everybody else. It was still really great to hear you actually talk it through. And obviously, you're saying more than was actually in the slides and things along those lines. So that was absolutely phenomenal. Now, what I would ask you while we wait and see if anybody else decides to put in a question is, as we've seen before, and as you mentioned, kind of right there toward the end, was the fact that, all these new technologies are coming, and it's just a matter of when are things going to change, and not necessarily if they're going to change. Now, remembering back when I was first really getting into animation, motion capture was really starting to become a new thing right then. And I think what happened with a lot of animators at that time, we very much had this fear that, all of our jobs are going away. If you can just strap a suit onto somebody, why do I need to continue to do those things? So I appreciate you also bringing that up at the end. Can you talk a little bit about how those changes, and you kind of went into this again already, but can you talk just a little bit about how those changes have actually bettered the animation inside of games, and for the animator, instead of it being more of a replacement for an animator? Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I mean, so it's kind of one of those things that never ends. Where I went to school entirely for 2D. I did a little bit of 3D in college, but it was Lightwave and not the most animation friendly platform. So really, when I left school, it was, at the time, it was, there's 2D animation and there's 3D animation that's stealing our jobs. And then you learn 3D and it's like, well, now mocap is stealing our jobs. And now you start using mocap, it's like, well, now procedural and machine learning is stealing our jobs. And uh, it doesn't steal it. What it becomes is another tool in your toolbox. And it's one of those that the more you spend the time to understand it and embrace it, the possibility space, um, you start to go, oh wow, this is a great instance where it's good. And with every new technology, you always sort of go overboard on it, and then you find out, oh, it works well for this, it works less well for this, and I actually want to go back to this other method that we had because it was something that I could control a little bit easier. Um, and maybe I want to use a hybrid version where I want a portion of, say, the pose matching from motion matching, but I don't want uh, all of the speed and trajectory stuff because that ends up messing it up. So maybe you just like it for your starts and stops, but not your locomotion, or so, like not the cycles and in-game state. Who knows?
Yeah.
So all of that really comes down to, you sort of need to just go with it and say this is going to be better because once I know it, because it really starts to come down more and more towards um, what do you do with a camera, what do you do with a paintbrush that makes the art, not the tool itself.
Right. Yeah, so that's actually really important to think about, because when we started, when motion capture came and we were all going, hey, but our jobs, there's always going to be those instances where we still need to have that human intervention of some kind. Obviously, we're always going to need someone to look over all those files, put all those files together, make sure that, when you're doing motion capture, the beginning and ending of a loop isn't going to be exact, and, getting those things aligned and so forth. But it also creates different types of jobs in animation as well. There's people that, may have never really learned really great hand key animation, but are making a great job of themselves in motion capture animation. And then also vice versa as well. There's several hand key animators out there who have never touched anything in motion capture. And I mean, motion capture has now been around for almost 2 decades. So with it being around for so long, yet we're still hiring tons of key animators everywhere. We still, we can't strap a suit onto a dragon, because I certainly don't know how to find one. And then, there's always going to be that. There's always going to be a style, and for which you need someone to go in there and intervene with it, whether that's a personality style, whether it's an art style. or anything else along those ways. And you actually brought up the whole 2D to 3D thing. I mean, we're still making 2D cartoons, and we actually have tons of different 2D games that are still coming out, and I buy almost all of them because I'm a nerd. So I just love watching some of that true hand-drawn animation from the past. We had Cuphead, which came out a few years ago. I mean, that was a marvel of 2D animation and games combined into more recent softwares. So I find that absolutely appealing to think about, and to remember that while the job may change, we're still going to be animators, and we still are going to have a large level of input on things for the foreseeable future.
Yeah.
Um,
And like you said, with the, so we've got a couple questions. Like you said, though, with that mocap stuff, it also does add new jobs and new aspects to our job, where one of my favorite parts of the job now is getting to direct mocap, because that is a moment where you're getting to work with actors, they're dramatic, comedy, or stunt, that are able to do these things you've had in your head in real life, and you start to see your character come to life for the first time, and you start to realize that that human touch happens as much there. And how do you get your team and everyone involved with that more? Because then it isn't just, hey, here's some mocap that I don't care about. It's, here's mocap that I directed with with an actor that I got to know and got to have fun with, and brought some interesting things to it that I wasn't expecting, that now you get to level up even more. And it's, like I said, if there was a job where I could just direct mocap all day, I might actually would just take that job.
Yeah. So basically, I mean, you have to be an animators at the core of who we are essentially actors, and we're just trying to convey that acting onto screen for other people to see, and and to get that realistic feel if that's what you're looking for. So it really, an animator can just really be in any type of different location. There's tech animators and all kinds of different things along those lines. So I really like to see it as opening up new windows. Not to mention all hand key animation versus motion capture animation for a game. Which one's going to take more time to create and more money in order to create, and how can we get more in quicker? Is going to be things like AI learning and things like motion capture and otherwise. So it's making a profound change on the video game industry, and then the video game industry actually makes profound changes on the rest of technology throughout the world. Thinking about things like VR and medical training and how they're using it, and mechanics are using it. It's not just games anymore, right? And VR is one of our newest forms of technology as far as games are concerned. So it's just really interesting to see how our jobs can actually change. We are running a little bit long right now, but we do have a couple of questions. Do you feel like reading those? And
100%. So I'll hit the ones in the Q&A, and then I think I see a couple in the chat as well. So Charles, do you have any update on how receptive game studios are to hiring animators who learn their craft on open source or non-industry standard software? So yeah, if you have a solid reel, that is going to be the first thing that studios care about. In general, every studio is going to have probably some different set of tools. Engines take some time to learn. Everyone assumes that hiring somebody new, even if they're an experienced animator in the industry, versus somebody that's coming in as more as their first job, is going to require some amount of training in software and tech. So if you understand animation, teaching you how to set keys and move the character around in a new tool isn't something that most studios are gonna be too worried about. Sean, how would machine AI motion matching work with more highly stylized animation, something that's more cartoony? Would you lose a lot of the personality? No. So really what it comes down to is whatever you feed into that is going to be what you get out of it. So if you put a bunch of stylized animation into it, what it's going to learn about and spit back out is stylized animation. Where you want to be conscious of some of that is a lot of stylization comes in the timing and the spacing. So you'll likely have some amount of work to try and figure out, okay, what does my tagging need to be like? Should, how do we play with our blending? Should we be doing something maybe at runtime that is doing stepped keys as opposed to linear spline curve blends, stuff like that? Would be where you want to start taking that stylized sensibility outside of, I made a stylized animation, into I'm thinking of a stylized animation system. Sean then also asked, they mentioned a 4-second or 4-loop walk cycle or run cycle, motion cycle instead of 1 loop. And what should we add in the motion for the reason of being 4 seconds? So really what we ended up doing for those is we, all of our locomotion started as mocap. So we would start with the actor on one end of the stage and have them to the other. And we would say, all right, run. And then we would make the beginning of that once they're at speed, because it takes them about a cycle and a half to get up to the full speed that you want. So then we would take that and then we would just make it loop at the beginning and end of multiple cycles. Because even though it's their gate and you're going to get it pretty close each time, you're just going to get a little bit of subtlety in that one time they might lean a little bit more with their left shoulder than their right. They might have their head a double bounce one time or something that you're not going to. The thing with loops that you see all the time is that you don't want something that is instantly recognizable on the 3rd loop, because every 3 loops now, if they run and then they have like a little snap that they do, it means you're going to see the snap every single time, and it's going to say, that's a loop. I see it. And really what you want are just sort of these long natural ones. Same thing with idle poses. Idle poses are really hard because it needs to look natural and it needs to constantly cycle. And sometimes you just need some extra time for it to breathe, and you just need little slight subtle variations to keep it alive and not feel like it's just on repeat. We got another question. Is there anything you'd like to see explored more in game locomotion in the future? Yeah, I mean, the thing that I've always sort of talked about and want to see in general in games is a lot of times when I'm I'm really active in the larger community around GDC and the animation exchange that we run and things like that. And it really comes down to, when you look at something like film, the question isn't, hey, how do we make this character move from left to right on the screen? It's, what is this character thinking about? What is their desire? What is their objective? What are they reacting to in the moment, into the scene and the environment, to the other characters? So for me, all game locomotion that I'm interested in is how do we get to that point where we're thinking about these characters as characters? How are we giving them opportunities to be reactive to the environment, to the other characters in the scenes, their personality, all of that sort of stuff, is for me what I'd like to see explored more. That's obviously really expensive because now you're just creating tons of variations. So it's not easy, but as we get these new technologies, motion capture helped a lot. Machine learning, all of these things start to remove some of that complexity on just making it work and get us to a point where it's whatever you can fill it with, it's going to get you what you need. All right, let me add a couple of these from the chat so that I don't lose them. Let me pull it out so I see his names. Kren asks, when going from idle to run, that small speed up animation, is it linear speed? Generally, no. One of the frames in there in the deck, it shows that where I was talking about getting them to the velocity. You can see that it's got a ease out of the idle into that blend of the velocity. So in general, you don't. Now, if you've got somebody like with rocket boots, then that's again, it's going to change your curve where you might actually want a frame or two of almost in place, where it's like the character's just maybe like scrunching up in place, and then almost a complete like step key or a linear, just like blasting you way forward ahead of the camera. Even like if you look at if you frame by frame an Anthem, when you fire your rocket boost to start flying, the animator on there is phenomenal. And you can see where they're playing with that brief second of anticipation, and then it kicks off so far that the camera kind of is back and has to like catch up, and you get that feeling of that sensation and that velocity and that motion that huge, super important. So in general, no, but like every rule, like once you understand what it is you're trying to convey, you can start to play with that. So from YouTube, from Tim, when it comes to run stops, sometimes the character has a lot of body rotation back and forth, but the stop animation is authored to stop on a particular side. So the transition on half the run may not blend nicely to the stop. Are there tricks to solve this, or would you just create another stop animation for the other side too? So yeah, generally where you want, so if you're going to allow for that exit to get out of there, then yeah, you want to probably try to maintain the mass. And I don't know if I would have a separate stop if you really like that stop and you think it feels really good. What I would maybe then do is actually create two different starts, because then what you get to do is tag up that animation to say if within this range, use this start, if within this range, use this start, and you could solve it that way, right? So I think it really sort of comes down to what is it that you like about that side to side, and where are you running into those problems, and how do you want to solve it? You might even also just be able to get away by mirroring it, right?
Right.
Yeah.
So I think we could actually field questions all night long. I think they're going to just keep on coming in, especially since we're blasting this out to a couple of different channels. So Mike, I just want to leave you here. Is there any last things you'd like to say? You did mention a little bit about GDC and some of the talks there, and you also mentioned, I think you brought up your channel on Discord. Is there anything that you want to talk about there, invite people to, or otherwise?
Yeah, I mean, so animstate.com. We've got lots of stuff on there as far as articles, the Discord channel that we run. You can find the link to that there, which has students and industry professionals from games and film, and a bunch of different channels to ask and talk about animation and games and all sorts of good stuff there. Also on there is the Animation Exchange, which is the annual online conference that we run every year that's free. The 4 years now, all those videos are up on YouTube that you can find through there as well. So yeah, animstate.com. That's the best place to go.
All right, Mike, thank you so much. Something really important about the ANIMATE and especially like the Discord with the community there is remembering how small the community actually is and how much we really do want to help each other out. Obviously, you showed a lot of stuff from like Ubisoft, even though you're not working with Ubisoft right now, and checking out their technologies, because they really don't want to try have too many trade secrets, because if we can lift everybody else up, that that's going to make all of our games better. So remembering that this is a really tight knit community throughout games is going to be really important for everyone's careers here, and making sure that you keep those connections. Like Mike mentioned at the beginning, like, oh man, bringing back up the old days. And when we worked together at ZeniMax, it was actually our connection and our friendship that led us to working together again on Agents of Mayhem when he was working there. So some of the really important aspects there, and something that Mike has worked really hard on, is to bring these big communities together and to continue the education through everything, is, as he had mentioned, going over there to ANIMATE and check everything out that he's had, and the huge community that we have there. So thank you, Mike, again, so much for coming. Just an absolutely amazing speech as per usual. I love listening to you talk and listening to how you think things through. So again, thank you so much. This was a huge privilege for me and for everybody else watching.
Nice, Scott. Thank you. This was fun. I love geeking out about this stuff.
Absolutely. Thank you, guys.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.